Let me preface this introduction by saying, as it relates first to the Rabbi, it happens in life that you become friends with someone, it develops into a special friendship, and it lasts independent of proximity. And when he was here at Congregation Beth, Israel, that's when I first knew him. And then for the last 18 years, he's been at what is easily one of the most important Jewish congregations in America, Chicago Sinai Congregation. As it relates to our other speaker, I have actually known he and his family since 1965. His father was a very prominent Methodist minister, as was his grandfather, and as are his brothers. And I was privileged to serve on the staff of one of his brothers, J. Irwin Trotter. He was, for 24 years, the senior minister at First United Methodist Church. And since I think I'm qualified to judge preachers and speakers, there was no better preacher in America. And it was a huge loss when he left. But he's here with us today, along with his wife, Jean. Would you welcome, please, the Reverend Mark Trotter.
George stated that we've known each other for a long, long time. I knew George before he was a sports analyst. And I love George. Oh, he has never come across a hyperbole that he didn't use. And I love to be introduced by him for that reason. George is an important person in this community, not only for his contribution through the City Club, which performs a wonderful public service, but George himself involved for over 50 years in significant ways in making San Diego a better city. So it's a privilege to be here at the City Club. Rabbi Sternfield and I go back to the time when we were fellow clergy in this city, and very proud of the fact that we began a tradition of celebrating Thanksgiving with the two congregations together back at least 30 years, I suppose, and that tradition continues even to this day as a very rich experience at least for the Methodists, and I hope for the Jewish community as well. Back in those days when Rabbi Sternfield was in San Diego, we also spoke together, became known as the Mike and Mark show, and usually what we would do is meet at the holy season, and for instance at Christmas, I would talk about Christmas, and Mike would talk about Hanukkah, and then again in the spring we would meet before groups and talk about Passover and Easter. But on this occasion of our reunion, we decided to talk about religion stories that are in the news today. First of all, the Forum on Religion by the Pew Foundation has revealed that those with no religious affiliation in the United States are at a new high, at about 20% of the population now. Newspapers have called this phenomenon the rise of the nuns, which sounds like the Catholic nuns storming the Vatican. But in newspaper speak, the nuns refer to those who answer none when asked, what is your religious affiliation? The other part of the story that got attention is that for the first time in American history, Protestants are no longer a majority religion in this country. In 2007, just 5 years ago, the Protestants made up 60% of the population, and in 2012 we are, according to Pew, 48% of the population. And I found that interesting because most of the nuns confessed that they have still twinges of transcendence, but they leave it as sort of a vague feeling and don't wish, I guess, to explore it, which from my experience also describes a whole lot of Protestants who are still on the rolls of churches. Previous polls have uncovered the vast ignorance that Protestants have of their religious tradition. For instance, a Methodist and a Presbyterian were talking, and the Methodist said to the Presbyterian that, I bet you don't even know the Lord's Prayer. And the Presbyterian said, I certainly do. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And the Methodist said, here's the $5, I didn't think you could do it. But The Pew Report also listed 4 possible causes of this, what they call unaffiliation. And one of them was the delay of marriage and the consequent delay of therefore having children, building a family, which made sense because most of the unaffiliated in terms of the demographic of age are in the age of 20 to 30, or 20 to 40, I should say. And it's been my experience that young people who've been raised in the church take a leave of absence when they are first on their own. But they come back, many of them, when they get married and have children. People getting married and starting families are doing it today at least 10 years later than they were when I first started performing marriages many years ago. In those days, most people in their early 20s were getting married. Today, it's the late 20s and even to the 30s. Having children is a way of experiencing the miracle of life. And it elicits feelings that life is not just the result of biological processes, but life is a miracle. It's a gift that is given to us. And in addition, having children also confronts you with your own limitations. And both experience very often lead you to religious institutions for guidance. So perhaps when the 20s and 30s and 40-year-olds in our society finally decide to get married and have children, they will all of a sudden become affiliated again. The second reason given for the rise of the nuns is the bowling alone syndrome that was outlined by Robert Putnam in his famous book of some years ago, which refers to the decline in numbers in community organizations. And I'm sure the same phenomenon affects the church membership and synagogue membership. If there's a detachment of younger people from the community, then the church and the synagogue will certainly be affected by that. The third cause listed is secularization of society. And on one level, that refers to the absence of religious gestures at public events, the absence of which I think is probably a good thing. But on another level, it refers to the disappearance of use of God in understanding our existence. The old story about Napoleon, who heard the French mathematician Laplace explain his theory of the solar system and its stability, which he had worked out in a mathematical model. And after Napoleon heard it, he asked, "Where is God in all of this?" And Laplace answered, "I have no need for that hypothesis." And that's secularism, the absence of God in our lives. So secularism is a major reason for the rise of the nuns, and I think it's probably the major reason. And Michael is going to talk about that, I understand, in more depth. But what I want to talk about is the Pew Study's fourth reason for the rise of the nuns, which is listed as political backlash, and is spelled out as a reaction against the religious right. Mainline Protestant churches have traditionally respected the doctrine of the separation of church and state, but right-wing or fundamentalist churches have not respected that separation, and that's what the nuns object to. Politically, the demographic of the nuns, turns out that most of them are Democrats and therefore probably liberal in their orientation. So it is no surprise that they object to the influence of the religious right. But it's the rise of the religious right, rather than the rise of the nuns, that I want to address this afternoon in some depth. In 1992, Samuel Huntington, the political scientist at Harvard University, published a book entitled The Clash of Civilizations. And the message of the book was that the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of conflict in the world. The end of the Cold War cleared the stage, he said, for a new, prolonged, and equally dangerous conflict, this time between the East and the West. This time the conflict would not be over political ideology like capitalism and communism, but it would be over religion, specifically Islam against Christianity. Now, I didn't like Huntington's book. My principal objection is that he seems to equate all religion with fundamentalism. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world. I doubt that many more than a fraction of them could be called Islamic fundamentalists ready to go to war with the West. There are also 2 billion Christians in the world, and the same could be said about them. So that's my objection. But in spite of that, Huntington's analysis of why religious become fundamentalist, I think is very, very helpful for all of us. He said this, that when civilizations feel that their values and their way of life are threatened, they turn to the center. And he said the center of every civilization is religion. So when under siege, they do 3 things. First, they declare those doctrines that bring identity to them and that bring meaning to their lives, they declare them to be infallible. You cannot touch them. The second thing they affirm is that they're sacred scripture. In the case of Islam, it's the Quran. In the case of Christianity, it's the Bible, which is a source of belief for both religious systems. They declare to be inerrant, dictated word for word by God, and without error. And thirdly, they all consider those who disagree with him to be infidels, which means, in effect, that they're the enemy. Now, I think you'll agree that that adequately describes what we have come to know as the Islamic fundamentalist, but I want to suggest that it can also help us understand the American fundamentalist. The use of the term fundamentalist began in America, incidentally. It's an American term, and in the beginning it was worn proudly by those Protestant Christians who left the mainline denominations and formed their own churches because they believed that the mainline churches had been seduced by modernism. Now, modernism can be defined as an openness to the radical changes, especially in intellectual life and in science in the modern world. And the 2 characteristics of modernism that the fundamentalists objected to specifically were the use of reason in interpreting Scripture and the acceptance of the Darwinian theory of evolution. Both directly challenged the inerrancy of Scripture. Therefore, fundamentalists believed that modernism was apostasy, that is, falling away from the faith, and they felt called to separate themselves and preserve the fundamentals of Christian faith. That's how fundamentalism was born in the last years of the 19th century. There eventually evolved 5 fundamentals, which if you did not believe them, you were declared to be infidel. The most important of those fundamentals, the one that is always listed first in the list of the 5, is the inerrancy of the Bible. Incidentally, another one of the 5 is the imminent return of Jesus, which fundamentalists believe will happen in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Thus, the unlikely, and in the opinion of some, the unholy alliance between fundamentalists in America and Israel. Which reminds me of the story of the fundamentalists who announced there's good news and bad news. The good news is Jesus has returned. The bad news is he's in Salt Lake City. Well, fundamentalism quickly spread in America, and by the 1920s, it had a significant presence in American life, perhaps a majority of the population. But it was ridiculed and pilloried by the press, and most devastatingly by H.L. Mencken, who was one of the most influential journalists in the 1920s. Then in 1925, a teacher in Clinton, Tennessee, named John Thomas Scopes, was disciplined, arrested, and charged with teaching evolution in the schools. Just a few years prior to that, the fundamentalists had got a law in the books of Tennessee that you couldn't do that. So thanks to the newspapers, the trial became a real spectacle. In fact, it's been described by some historians as really being a circus. William Jennings Bryan, who was 3 times the candidate for president of the United States, also Secretary of State under President Wilson, probably the nation's greatest orator, and a fundamentalist of sorts, volunteered to prosecute the case. And Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous attorney, and an atheist of sorts, volunteered to defend Scopes. Now, the event had nothing to do with Scopes. It had to do with a clash of cultures, the modern world and the world of fundamentalism. And it was obvious that Darrow had defeated Bryan. In fact, he had humiliated him. He had ridiculed him. And incidentally, Bryan died 5 days after the trial. But the Scopes trial didn't get rid of fundamentalism. The press just stopped paying attention to it. And fundamentalism went underground and out of sight and continued to thrive in thousands of small towns and villages across the nation, especially in the Midwest and in the South, and nurtured by thousands and thousands of little tiny radio stations that were manned by fundamentalist preachers broadcasting 24 hours a day. Now remember the Huntington thesis. When people feel their way of life is threatened, they turn to the center and make their beliefs infallible and their scripture inerrant. The humiliation came in the 1920s. The assault on their values came in the 1960s. Liberals in America generally hail the 1960s as a time of victory. It's a time of victory for free speech, and especially for civil rights and the liberation of women. And the seed was planted for the liberation of homosexuals, which would not occur for another 20 years, but the seed was part of the 60s. Fundamentalists saw the 60s as a direct attack on American life and the values that give meaning to their lives. Prior to 1960, fundamentalism was associated with radio preachers. After 1960, it's associated with television, reaching millions and millions of people, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson being the pioneers. In the 1970s, fundamentalists organized politically in what was called the moral majority. Now, in the moral majority, saving America or restoring America to what they believe it used to be before the liberals ruined it, became in essence one of their fundamentals. And though the moral majority no longer exists, the voting bloc created by them still does and grows. Today, fundamentalist churches are actively involved in partisan politics, seeking to restore the values that they believe define America. Harvey Cox pointed out sometimes a wonderful illustration that in Native American culture, there is an office that's called the storyteller. And the storyteller in the tribe has a status equal to that of the chief. The purpose of the storyteller is to tell the stories that define the nation, who they are, why they're here, what is important in their life. The meaning of life, in other words, is to be found in stories. And then Cox pointed out that every culture, including American culture, has storytellers. In America that I grew up, there were 3 institutions that had the role of storyteller. One was a home, the other was a church, and the third was a school. The purpose of those 3 institutions in American life was to transmit the values of their heritage as a family and as a nation to the next generation. Now ask yourself, who is the storyteller in our society? Who teaches the young about values, about the meaning of life, about what it means to be a man or a woman, And I think you'd have to answer, it is the media in all of its many forms. And that is why the life of a fundamentalist centers in the family, in the church, and in the Christian school or the home school, because they feel besieged in the modern world and they aim to change that. Now, I don't know about you, but this is a concern for me for this reason. Because fundamentalists believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and they believe that they are called to restore that heritage. They do not believe in the separation of church and state. In fact, they are engaged in a strategy to find representatives who will share their view. And in that regard, there is no difference, I suggest, between an Islamic fundamentalist and a Christian fundamentalist. They both believe that religion, their religion, should make the laws and govern the nation. So I'm concerned. Dorothy Sayers wrote that the first thing a principal does is to rise up and kill someone. She was referring to those who believe that others should believe what they believe. And history is full of such instances, most of them about religions, when they have the power of the state behind them. So I'm concerned less about the rise of the nuns than the rise of fundamentalism, wherever it abides, either in Islam or in Christianity. Thank you.
It's so good to see a lot of old friends today, and to be back in San Diego. I'm so pleased that George issued this invitation to me. First, he's right. No matter how much time goes by, friendships really don't change much. We look about the same, wouldn't you say, George? Yeah, and there's nobody quite like George Mitrovich. I think we all know that. He's one of a kind, and God bless him. I'm especially delighted that he asked me to share this day with Mark Trotter, who I have the greatest affection for. Our relationship does go back to much earlier days at Beth Israel and First United Methodist, and also Downtown Rotary, as a matter of fact, of which he's a past president. And we had this idea when both of us were pretty young and didn't have much gray hair, about putting our two congregations together, rather. And this happened every year. I guess it's still going on. We used to trade insults, very mild insults, basically, as to who was getting grayer. And I guess we'd have to say it's a total tie at this point. Yeah. You know, a lot of other clergy and public figures at our age are starting to think about their legacies and what they want to leave behind. And there is a story, got to share a story with you, of one particular well-known academician who decided to write his own obituary to make sure that when he died, everything would be properly inscribed. And he wrote this multi-page obituary of all of his accolades and accomplishments. And sure enough, he died. And his wife sent in the obituary to the local newspaper, and they said, well, yes, we'll be happy to print it, but you do have to know that we charge 50 cents a page. And that's a lot of pages. 50 cents a word, rather, 50 cents a word. She said, well, okay, let me think about this. How about this? Bob died. And he said, no, that's fine, but we do have a minimum of 5 words. She said, okay, Bob died, Cadillac for sale. Okay, that's the warm-up. You know, we have these things. My comments today begin with a trip I made a few years ago to Prague, which is one of the oldest Jewish centers in the world. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. It's a beautiful place and with some amazing sights. And I was taken by those sights, of course, but what I took in Prague, and maybe some of you have been there, is you have churches everywhere, but nobody goes to church. Well, I should add to that, yes, tourists go to church, and most of the churches are used for classical music concerts, which are advertised in large placards on all the church fronts, and that's the only way they get people to go to church. And actually, Prague is probably the great extreme of this story, and of course it was part of the Eastern European bloc at one time. But you can go to most countries in Western or Central Europe today and find something very similar. In France, for example, who goes to church? Basically, widows and tourists, once again. And I'm not saying that our situations are identical, but they are not totally dissimilar either. And they do give us a certain vision of, I'm not going to say the likelihood, but the distinct possibility that our country could be headed in a very similar direction. And Mark referred to this well-known study that's being written up a lot about the rise of the nuns. And it is true that that number is today about 20%, but it shows every indication that it's going to continue to rise. And I wanted to talk about perhaps some of the causes of that, not so much from the point of view of reaction to fundamentalism, but perhaps in a little different context than you might be expecting. And over the years, I have prided myself in trying to be as candid as I can. And rather than say the things that most people would expect their rabbi, minister, or priest to say, to use a little different perspective and to look at things in a more realistic prism. And so that's what I'm going to do. Although the fundamentalists and the mega churches are drawing large crowds, as we see on TV, and I think there's a very large megachurch right here in the San Diego area. The mainstream denominations, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Unitarians, United Church of Christ, and also I should add Reformed Jews, are all experiencing very dramatic declines in attendance and affiliation. And the Catholic churches have taken an especially hard hit. Were it not for the influx of immigrants, especially from Latin America and in Chicago's case, from Poland, their numbers would be a lot worse. And in our own Jewish community, it's no secret that our numbers are shrinking, not only demographically, but also in terms of actual participation or affiliation. Also symptomatic of the decline of organized religion has been the virtual proliferation of books that are either anti-religious or pro-atheist. And these are not, by the way, identical terms. Several of the books actually have become bestsellers. Maybe you've even read some of them. Sam Harris's book called The End of Faith, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, The Portable Atheist and God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything by the late Christopher Hitchens, who certainly had a way with words. And having read most of them, I can tell you that these are not the rantings of cranks. Most of them are well written and reasonably well reasoned, and I would recommend them to you, not because I'm anxious for you to go over to the dark side, but because these books challenge us to consider more carefully our own beliefs, and more than that, to ask ourselves about the purpose of organized religion in now the 21st century. What are the reasons for this undeniable trend in opposition to organized religion? It seems to me that there are several common threads connecting most of these phenomena. The first is a widespread sense of anger over all the harm that organized religion has done, historically and even in our own times. We are all painfully aware of radical Islamic terrorism, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, and all the rest. But radical Islam is not the only culprit. The overwhelming number of conflicts of the past century have been to some degree religious conflicts. Hindus versus Muslims in India and Pakistan, Shiites versus Sunnis in Iraq, Catholics versus Protestants in Ireland, Jews versus Muslims in the land of Israel and around the world, as a matter of fact. The word religion is often coupled with extremism, persecution, and intolerance. And in many ways, we must admit that religion has incited violence and persecution, of course, always in the name of God or Christ or Allah or whoever. This is undeniable. There's also been an extreme reaction over the priest abuse scandals that have plagued the Catholic Church. Those of us who are familiar with the Catholic Church of America, and I come from a very Catholic city, Chicago, we understand that overwhelmingly the Catholic Church is served by dedicated men and women who sacrifice greatly for the sake of their faith. But there have also been the rotten apples that have gotten away with predatory crimes for far too long. And there is an undeniable stain on the Catholic Church that is not going to be so easily erased, no matter how many lawsuits are settled or apologies issued by Catholic hierarchy. I had a wonderful friend in Chicago, a priest who did pass away, and we used to talk about this all the time, Father Frank Simarusti of blessed memory. And there was no finer priest or clergy person in the world, as far as I was concerned. If I could have elected him Pope, I would have been delighted to do so. And he loved being a priest. It was his life's calling. But he told me that when he went out on the streets, he would no longer wear his clerical collar because he was continuously subjected to abuse by people, just strangers, who would say things like, "Oh, where are you going, to abuse a kid today?" or something like that. And it breaks my heart to tell this story because of what a fine person he was, and overwhelmingly that remains true of the vast majority of the Catholic clergy. But again, there is this problem that cannot be denied. Also, changing the subject a little bit, not to be ignored is the hucksterism of TV evangelists and mega preachers who spew, if you'll pardon me for saying, feel-good religious nonsense and ask no more of their followers that they should make generous donations. In many ways, some religious institutions are simply big businesses with slick advertising and hawking their wares and manipulative appeals for money, often aimed, I would say, at the most desperate and the most impressionable. Meanwhile, some of their most visible leaders fly around in private jets, live in mansions, build bigger and bigger edifices, although one seems to have rather crumbled recently, the Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove. I guess the building is fine, but the ministry is not so good. The feathering of their own nests seems to be the most important concern, of course, always under the guise of saving souls. Unless you think I may be letting down the Jewish religion, I want to tell you that our preoccupation with the state of Israel as a substitute or a vicarious experience for religion itself has dominated far too much. That for so many Jews, Judaism is equated with defense of Israel almost in a myopic sense and not seeing the bigger picture. And I regard this as a problem, but also a turnoff for younger Jews who may not have the same recollections of the Holocaust or see the same kind of dangers that another generation saw. Put all this together, and it's not so difficult to understand why organized religion is falling on tough times, why more and more people are opting for secularism or becoming the nuns. And I should add this, that there is really no evidence that immorality or lawlessness is in any way on the rise in those countries where organized religion is evaporating. Decent people, who are of course the overwhelming number of every society, do not seem to require religious institutions to teach them how to be good people. Now, I cannot deny that I am disheartened by the harm that is perpetrated in the name of religion. I also sometimes wonder what I'm doing as a congregational rabbi, but here I am, still at it after nearly 40 years. And so, as we say in Hebrew, af al pi chen, which means all of this notwithstanding, I remain devoted to my Jewish religion and to organized religion itself, because I believe at its core, religion must continue to occupy an essential place in the fabric of our society and the world at large. I'm a rabbi, of course, so I'm going to use the language of my own faith to describe what I mean. The Jewish religion has always been a Messianic faith. By that, I do not mean simply that we believe that the Messiah will someday come back to Salt Lake City and bring about world peace and well-being. To be Messianic, as both Christianity and Islam also are in their own ways, is to believe that the world that we live in is not the best of all possible worlds. To be Messianic is to believe that we are to be God's partners in the task of what we like to call in Judaism tikkun olam, which means repairing our very broken world. At its very core, the Messianic ideal is the essence of almost all Western great faiths and is at the heart of Judaism and certainly of Christianity as well. And that is simply to make life better for us, for our children, for our grandchildren, for humanity, to work tirelessly for the day when there will be an end to poverty, when disease will be eradicated, when violence between countries and neighbors and religions will come to an end. And the greatest thing that organized religion can offer is the dynamic of people banding and bonding together to do more collectively than they could ever simply do as individuals. That's the point. The greatest thing that organized religion can offer is the dynamic of banding and bonding people together to do more collectively than they could ever do simply as individuals. I don't think I have to tell you that our world is not getting a lot better. In fact, there are more conflicts, more terrorism, more suffering, more hunger, 1 billion people going hungry every single day, more pollution, more waste of resources, no end in sight of racism, genocide, cruelty. And I cannot believe that that is the way it is supposed to be. I believe that the God in whom I do continue to believe and in whom I have faith wants this to be a better world than it is, but that God simply cannot do it by himself or herself. God has given us the gifts of moral insight and conscience to envision the way the world could be, and that is the Messianic vision. And God, I believe, relies upon people to respond with our hearts, with our hands, and with our minds. And so the purpose of organized religion, I believe, is to awaken that sense of urgency for us all simply to do more, to join together as communities of faith devoted to the task of repairing the world. Religion, I believe, therefore, exists to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And as I see it, the reason why the nuns are on the rise and that organized religion is in decline is because, frankly, too many religions have become a part of the problem and not the solution. We should be promoting peace and harmony and not fomenting violence. We should be committed to the goal of making life better for every single person on our planet. And religious groups should be putting in their energy as to how they can increase peace, respect, and understanding. And although I don't really want to speak much about the fundamentalists today, this is my chief criticism of fundamentalism, that is having such a formidable effect in America today, and that is fundamentalism of all kinds is contributing to the problem and not the solution. It is by its very nature divisive. It is we're right and you're wrong, we're good, you're sinful, and it is anything but constructive to making our society a better place. And so that leads me simply to say a few words on God's behalf. Not that God has ever spoken to me personally, I assure you. I don't really believe that most people are atheists at heart, that there are really that many who have stopped believing in God, but there are many who have stopped believing in religion. And I believe that most people continue to believe that we do live in a created world, that there is a transcendent source of moral law, whether one chooses to call this God or by any other particular name. And my great concern is that in rejecting organized religion because of its sins that I have described, society may also dispense with the tremendous power that religion has to make this a far better world. Humanity, I believe, must never let go of the conviction that the world in which we live is not yet the best of all possible worlds, and that we as people of faith, of religious communities, have a role in bringing about that dream. Thank you.
That was tremendous.
Thank you.
Rabbi Trotter. The depth of what they had to say, hugely, hugely significant. And I'm glad it's going to be on YouTube. And we'll repeat this show in Denver after the first of the year. They were wonderful. And I just, seriously, I want to leave it at that. They will be around if you want to have a dialogue with them. They'll be happy to do that. But let's now express to both of them our very great appreciation.